So hi everyone, my name is Emmy Racine. I'm the Programme Manager for PPI Ignite Network at UCC, and part of my job is building capacity in PPI amongst researchers across the university. And today's recording is all about PPI in HRB funding applications. And I've got some recorded videos from Miss Casey Donaghy in this presentation as well. She's a PPI contributor based in NUI Galway. So I think it'll be good to hear the PPI contributor perspective on PPI as well. So I suppose to start, I'm well aware that researchers that come to me looking for PPI support, really their knowledge of PPI varies. Some people have done PPI before and, have got great experience in participatory research methods. Others have just heard of PPI in recent years, but maybe don't have very much experience. And some have absolutely no knowledge of what PPI is, and it can be confusing. So I'm going to go right back to the basics. And in this workshop, part one of this workshop, I'm going to talk all about PPI itself. What is it? Why is it needed in our research? And then I'm just going to briefly give some practical examples of PPI just to show you what it looks like in practice. And then, of course, we're going to talk about PPI and specifically HRB research funding applications. You are probably more than likely developing a research funding application to the HRB, and you're probably a little startled at the PPI section and wondering how you go about planning your PPI and incorporating it into your project. So I'll talk about that, and then I'll very briefly at the end talk a little bit more about PPI Ignite Network at UCC and the supports that we offer you as researchers, and how you can incorporate that into your HRB application as well. So firstly, what is PPI? So PPI is all about doing research with or by members of the public rather than to, about, or for them. So it's really about researchers partnering with members of the public to decide what research is done and how it is done as well. So it's really this kind of co-researching approach, where patients or general members of the public are involved in making active decisions about their research. About your research, I should say. It's not about involving members of the public as research participants or subjects. So if you're collecting their data, if you're analyzing their data and publishing results based on their data, that is not PPI. And it's not about keeping the public informed about your research. So it's really about that two-way relationship between researchers and members of the public, where you're actively involving them in the decisions you're making about your research. I think the terms public involvement and public engagement often get conflated. And I know with many funding applications, you'll also have an engagement section that you will need to fill out. So just to clarify, public engagement is very much about raising awareness of research. So it's really this one-way communication where researchers are communicating their research out to members of the public. Public involvement, or PPI, is, like I mentioned already, it's actively involving people in making decisions about research. So it's a two-way communication. Not only are researchers telling the public about their research, they're asking them for their input, for their feedback, for their perspectives on how they should get it done. Now, one of the reasons that these terms often get conflated is because they both fall under this umbrella term of engaged research. And engaged research is gaining momentum, and is a priority for research funders. And here in the university, we've got an engaged research officer. So public involvement falls under that. I suppose traditionally, PPI is very much a health research term, but it is kind of broadening out now and falling under social care research, and kind of, we're seeing it being embedded across the university, but it is known as a health specific and a health research related term. So what's the rationale for PPI? Why should you do it? Well, firstly, there's this moral and ethical argument for PPI. And this is the whole argument that the people who are most affected by the research that you're going to be conducting should have a say in what research is done and how it is done. So that's this idea of nothing about us without us. And this has roots in the HIV/AIDS activism, breast cancer activism in the 90s. It has a long kind of history. Then there's also this argument that citizens have a right to influence research that's being funded by public money. And the HRB is funded by the taxpayer. So there's this rationale that the taxpayer or citizens should be involved in deciding what research is funded, how research is conducted, and kind of ethical elements as well. There's also a pragmatic argument for PPI. So, we've seen studies where, it can increase the relevance, the acceptability of research, and the accessibility as well, in terms of, how papers are written and how they're communicated. Why do you need to do PPI? So I suppose just from a very kind of selfish or personal perspective for your research funders now are really expecting that PPI will be written into your research proposals. So that's particularly the HRB here in Ireland, but other funders are following the same route. So you've probably seen, something along these lines in the application that you're preparing, where there's a specific public involvement section of the application. But it's not just research funders. Ethics committees now are moving towards PPI, and we also see quite a few academic journals, particularly those in the BMJ portfolio. They all require they don't require PPI, but they require that you state whether you have incorporated PPI in your research, and if you haven't, then you need to clearly justify why you have chose not to do so. So it's really gaining momentum, gaining popularity, and it's increasingly becoming a very important component of research. When should PPI be conducted? Well, look, I always tell people the earlier the better. The earlier the better. If you can get patients, members of the public involved at the very ideas stage of your research, before you even start completing the funding application, you're really going to see the best results, because they'll really be involved from the very beginning. They'll have an impact on the decisions you make about your research from the get-go. But at the same time, it's never too late. So, if you're coming to the end of a research project and you're at the writing up stage, there's still room to involve lay members on your team or in decisions that you're making. So this is a handy, I don't know, it might come across, the writing might be a bit too small now for you to see, but it's a handy kind of infographic, if you like, of the different stages of research and the different kind of elements that you can involve patients and members of the public in. So, right from the beginning in identifying and prioritizing research areas and research topics, right through to dissemination, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation. So that's a handy one to refer to when you're planning your PPI. So what does involvement look like? So people often ask me this. So the definition of public involvement, doing research with or by members of the public rather than to, about, or for them. It's an excellent definition, but it is still quite broad. And it's hard to know, the specific kind of tasks that members of the public are involved in research. So for example, and these are absolutely just examples, but you might think about, asking a member of the public, the HRB actually for this funding call will ask members of the public to review your grant applications that you're submitting, but you might ask a member of the public to review your grant application prior to submitting. So you might, or maybe more than one member of the public, you might have a group that you might convene and you'll ask them to review the grant application and give you their thoughts. You might also set up a community advisory board for a research project. You might, we often see researchers, healthcare professionals, and service users coming together to co-design a new intervention. So where you're not only involving members of the public, you're involving multiple stakeholders in the process. Members of the public might be involved in a general kind of research priority setting exercise. You might have a patient sitting on a trial advisory committee, user testing of a new health app, members of the public advising on study recruitment processes. You might, invite patients to co-present study results at a conference. There are just some examples of ways that you can involve members of the public, both in an individual at an individual level, but also you could kind of set up community advisory boards or PPI groups that would inform your research as you go along. Why do patients and members of the public want to be involved in research? This is a question that comes up quite often, because I think as researchers, particularly those who aren't necessarily patient facing, they find it very hard to understand the relevance of their research to members of the public. And, you know, they expect or they presume that no one else would have an interest. And actually that's more often than not the case. Any PPI groups that I've been involved in, PPI contributors have been so enthusiastic, so involved, really excited, particularly if it's a specific, you know, disease area, or, you know, people have specific experience of the topic that you're researching, and it can be a really beneficial kind of activity for PPI contributors to be involved in and feel like they're making a difference. So here we're going to hear from Casey Donaghy, who's a PPI contributor, as I mentioned earlier, and she's going to talk a little bit about why she wanted to be involved in PPI.
Hi guys, my name's Casey. I'm a PPI contributor in Galway. I've been a contributor for a couple of years, and yeah, I've had, you know, various experiences doing different projects, getting involved in just different types of involvement as well. So it's been quite an interesting journey. I was chatting to Emmy before this and kind of talking about the reasons that I got involved. So I'm going to kind of go through that. So like, I always had an interest in research. I was born with a physical condition called cerebral palsy. So just a physical disability that happened before birth. So looking at research kind of around physical disabilities or adaptation to challenges in life has always interested me. So I always wanted to just get my voice heard in research that kind of revolved around that. So that resulted also in me doing a psychology degree. This really got me interested in research because I had to do a final year project, and I just saw the huge need for PPI in that, in the way that, like, I was reading all these articles. There's only so much information I can find out from reading a book, you know, or, you know, 500 articles. And really hearing from a person, they're going to teach you what you don't know, So I really appreciate PPI from that perspective, as well as for me being a PPI contributor and getting my voice heard.
So that's, I think that's a great phrase. They'll teach you what you don't know. And often we're conducting our research, and we've got underlying kind of biases, and often we don't see the bigger picture, or we don't have experience of the particular topic area that we're researching. And that's what PPI contributors can do. They can come in and show you what you don't know, and just bring that kind of personal perspective to the research that you're conducting. So we're going to hear from Casey again further on in this presentation. And for some reason, okay, sorry, for some reason that wouldn't move on. So practical example of PPI. I'm not going to spend too long on this because really the focus of this session is PPI and funding applications, but I just want to give you an idea of what PPI looks like in practice. So this is an example of a study here in University College Cork based in the School of Public Health. And it was the IDEA study, Improving Diabetes Eye Screening Attendance. And it was led by the PI, Dr. Sheena McHugh. And it was all about improving uptake to the National Diabetic Screening Programme, retinopathy screening programme. So this project from the very beginning had a designated PPI coordinator, for the Ideas PPI group. So there was a specific group set up to inform the study as the study went on over the 2 years of the project. So how PPI contributors were identified. So various strategies were used. Often people come to me looking, how they'll looking for ideas on how to recruit PPI contributors. So we put posts on social media, in diabetes support groups and education sessions. We partnered with Diabetes Ireland clinics, put up posters in their waiting rooms and flyers. We went along to GP waiting rooms. We did all sorts of things to get people in. And our idea at the time was to establish a panel, because there was a number of different diabetes related projects kind of ongoing in the School of Public Health. So we thought, instead of just recruiting for one group, we'll try and establish a panel there was over 35 people with diabetes, their family members, carers. And then from that, we recruited 5 to be part of the PPI group. So the group, we had a good mix of gender, we had a good mix of type 1 and type 2 diabetes, and we had urban and rural contributors as well. So I always say to people, PPI isn't like research. You don't need a representative sample of your target population, but it is good to try and get as much diversity as you can, try and get a mix of ages, try and get a mix of genders, backgrounds, ethnicity, status, as much as possible, because that can really bring different kind of perspectives and different ideas into your group. So there's a photo of us. I actually coordinated that group, and there's a photo of us at our first meeting, and we all look kind of shy. By the end of the 2 years, we were, much more comfortable with each other. But that was our very first meeting. So our meetings took place, we had 4 meetings a year, so every quarter, and it was a 2-year project. And the meetings that we always had for the evening time between 6 and 8, because that was what suited the group. Some of them were working, some of them were minding grandchildren, and the evening time is what suited. So I would always say, work with your PPI contributors to find times and locations and all of that suit them. We always met in the Western Gateway building, and I always made sure that we met in the same room so that they knew exactly where they were going. There was no one getting lost. There was no nervousness before meetings with people not being able to find the room, etc. And then, of course, since March, the project was kind of finishing up around then, but we've had meetings on Zoom since March. Refreshments were always provided, tea, coffee, diabetes friendly biscuits, and don't underestimate the power of food because it really can be an icebreaker, particularly at the first few meetings. People can really kind of bond over having a cup of tea. So that's important. So the meetings generally followed a flexible format. I would have a couple of PowerPoint slides just to discuss where the project is at, how their suggestions from the last meeting were incorporated. And then we'd have 2 or 3 items to discuss and decide on at the meeting. So whatever was going on at the project at the time, any questions that the researchers had, and that they felt the study would really benefit from a wider input, we would discuss and decide on them. Sometimes they were very general, kind of brainstorming and coming up with ideas, and other times they were specific, can you please review this document, this patient information sheet, or this press release, or whatever it was. So it'll be a really specific task. So this is just to give an idea. This was actually a HRB DIFA project. So for any of you developing DIFA applications, this will give you a good idea. So these are just some of the things, the timeline of the study, and then, the areas that they were involved in. So for example, at the very beginning of the project, they participated in a consensus process to inform the intervention development. They were involved in developing and reviewing the intervention materials. They reviewed items for the process evaluation. They provided input to funding to the main trial funding application that was submitted subsequent to this feasibility trial. They were involved in developing and piloting the patient topic guide and questionnaire. They were involved in writing and reviewing patient summaries. So, lots of different things as the study went on. So what difference did it make? Again, I'm just going to talk really briefly, and I'm going to give one example of how their contributions made a difference to the research. So this was a questionnaire that was being sent out to people with diabetes and healthcare prevention healthcare professionals prior to the intervention. So this was during the intervention development stage. And this questionnaire, I know it was 5 pages long. I know you can't see the writing, but it was quite complex. So participants were asked to rate each intervention component based on their acceptability and their feasibility. And there was a lot of different components and there was a lot to take in. We brought this to the PPI group and we kind of set the scene and asked them to give their feedback on the 5-page questionnaire. So after their feedback, then this was what the questionnaire looked like. So some of the changes they suggested were changing the questionnaire to a yellow questionnaire, so printing it on yellow paper. And the reason for this was because it was being sent out in a pack that had a number of different documents. It had an evidence summary, it had consent forms, it had all sorts. And they said it would be really clear when the participant would receive the pack in the post that you could say in the letter, please complete the yellow questionnaire and return it using the envelope provided. And it would be really clear what one the yellow questionnaire was. So very simple, but just helping people to complete it. It was reduced from 5 pages to 3 pages. None of the actual intervention components were reduced, but it was just a change of layout, change of wording, etc. The instructions were made a lot clearer, and we also included an example of how to fill out the questionnaire, which I thought was a really good idea, because we forgot that a lot of the time, members of the public, they're not really all that familiar with completing questionnaires, and this is a particularly complex one. So we included instructions. We inserted headings to avoid repetition throughout the questionnaire. So that made it a lot easier to read. Rating headings were accepted, so that inserted, sorry. So there was a definition of acceptable and a definition of feasible. And again, that was something that the researchers didn't think of, because researchers working in intervention development usually, are well aware of the differences between acceptability and feasibility. But to a general member of the public or even a healthcare professional, it's not as clear the distinction between the two. So the definitions were included. Some of the items were combined to make it shorter and easier to complete. Some of the wording was changed. So one of the words in particular that the PPI group weren't too keen on was the word testimonial. So they preferred a personal story. So some of the wording was changed throughout. And we also learned the importance of a cup of tea. So one of the things that the PPI contributors are saying, and I thought it was just such a good tip, and I've used it so often in different questionnaires since. So we were going to be phoning the participants before we sent out the pack. We knew who we were sending these questionnaires to. And they suggested phoning the participants, telling them we were sending out the pack, giving them a brief kind of description of what was going to be in the pack, and they said, you should give a bit of a warning that there's quite a few documents in the envelope. So say, look, I know there's a lot there, and I know there's a lot to read through, but what you do is pop the kettle on, have a cup of tea, make a cup of tea, sit down for 10 minutes and go through the different documents and fill out the questionnaire. So we said that to participants on the phone. We kind of reframed this questionnaire as if it was almost like a self-care exercise. So pop the kettle on, make yourself a cup of tea, and have a bit of me time with this questionnaire. And it worked. And we, everyone that we sent the questionnaire to filled it out, which is unusual in our line of work. So and a couple of the participants, so a lot of the participants came in then for different elements of the intervention development, for consensus meetings and so on. And a couple of them actually said to the research team that they thought that was a great suggestion. They popped the kettle on, had a cup of tea, and they filled out the questionnaire. So very simple tip, but can change the outcome of your research, because you need people to complete the questionnaires that you're developing. So that's just one example of how PPI can change your study materials, and the kind of approach that you take with your research. We're going to hear from Casey here now again, and hear what she has to say.
So I was involved in a good few different projects over the time. I'm going to just go through one or two, just to kind of show the variety of what you can do with PPI contributors on your side. The first one I was ever involved with, first study, was called KEDS, multimorbidity and adherence study. Or I won't be saying that again. But a study about having multiple conditions and adhering to taking multiple medications when it can be challenging. It was a big workshop where, as a PPI contributor, I was chatting to nurses, pharmacists, researchers. We were all at a table discussing this idea with each other. So it was quite open and easygoing, friendly. We would chat between ourselves, and then when we had a few ideas, we'd then, chat to the whole group. So it's a nice, friendly atmosphere. After this big kind of workshop was done, I ended up hearing that they needed actors to, or needed people to act out these results in a play, be the patient that, is telling the video camera all of these results. So I was like, yeah, sign me up for that. That'll be interesting to see, what I look like on camera, kind of similar to today. So that was just a thing on the side that I didn't really know was going to come until it came, but was just another way of doing research with PPI contributors. Since then, I've become part of the NUI Galway Public Advisory Panel, which is a group of 10 people, all with different kind of life experiences, getting to speak about their issues, getting to have their input in researching, like reviewing grants, with reviewing kind of questionnaires. We'd have researchers come in, being like, what do you think of this question? Is it open-ended enough? Just kind of simple things like that, but they're actually not that simple when you get, feedback. Having a person who's actually reading the questionnaire for the first time without their research head on, will see something that you don't see. So I did things like that, and actually, I'm not sure if you heard of the website I Have Facts, but this was big around the time of COVID, where, it was put up facts that were researched and reviewed about COVID, does a mask help, etc. Won't go into it. But then my kind of job or my contribution was to make sure it was readable and understandable to the public, whether it be, a young child or, just different perspectives. So that was my job. And I think there was a few of us PPI contributors, so, different sheets will be given to each of us. And then, since then, I've been working with kind of PPI Ignite, giving workshops and seminars like today. So as you can see, it's kind of, people have many talents, many of them talented, but many things that they can do. So get creative with your PPI contributors, and never know what research you can do. But yeah, that's just a quick overview of two of my main contributions.
Super. So just if you want to have a look at other examples of PPI, there are case studies on our PPI Ignite Network at UCC website. They're all UCC PPI case studies. There's also case studies on the National PPI Ignite Network website. And then the HRB have case studies as well on their website, PPI Stories. So they're the links there if you want to have a look at more examples of PPI. So part 3, this is the part that you've probably been waiting for, PPI and HRB research funding applications. So if you're in the middle of completing a funding application, you've probably come across this PPI section that it varies depending on the funding call, but this is kind of a general gist of how it looks. So you are asked if you are including PPI in your application, and then please describe PPI at each stage of the research cycle. So in this particular call, they asked that for each stage, please include the purpose of this involvement and, where applicable, how PPI has influenced or changed the work that has already been planned. So before you begin thinking about your PPI, it's really important that you read the call guidance notes, and you probably have already, but if you haven't, read the call guidance notes and have a look at the PPI section and what exactly they are looking for. Also, it's important to remember that most of the HRB funding schemes now include a public review as part of the scheme, as well as a peer review. So often researchers completing funding applications are always thinking about the peer reviewers and making sure their application is scientifically sound and their methods are robust, and they're ticking all the boxes for the peer review. But the HRB schemes now also have a public review. So there'll be usually 2 public reviewers will be asked to review your application. So you will receive the written feedback from the public reviewers, and you will have the opportunity to respond in the exact same way that you have the opportunity to respond to the peer reviewers before the application goes on for panel decision making. So the public reviewers don't necessarily score your application or your PPI elements of the proposal, but their reviews are very much integrated into the panel decision making. So the panel who are deciding whether your grant is funded or not get a copy of the peer review and your response, and also a copy of the public review and your response. So it is incorporated into the decision making. So for more information on the public review process, the HRB have some great information on their website. But just to be aware that when you're writing, I suppose, it's not just about getting the PPI section right. You really want to get the whole application right, that it's that you're incorporating the PPI throughout the application, so that it's not just in the PPI section, that you're really embedding it into the project, and that you ensure that certain elements of your application, like the lay summary, the background, most definitely the PPI section, are that bit easier to read, and you're kind of being careful of scientific jargon and acronyms, and that kind of a thing, because there will be public reviewers reading it. So some of the aspects of the research that public reviewers are asked to review, so these are the questions that the HRB have on their website, and obviously it varies depending on the call, but these are some of the things that they'll be asked to have a look at. So, is the plain English summary of the funding application easy to understand? Could it be improved? In your opinion, will knowing the answer to the research question make a difference to real people? Has there been any public and patient involvement in the development of the application? Are there any plans for public and patient involvement in the research throughout its lifetime? Have the applicants included any budget for public involvement? That's really important, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So would you be willing to take part as a participant in the research if it related to you as a member of the public? Could you identify or suggest any areas for improvement of PPI in the research, so they can get really critical here? And how might the researchers make sure the findings of the research reach the general population? So there are things that, when you're submitting your proposal, that you need to make sure that, you're going to tick all of these boxes as well. So as far as I'm concerned, I think when you're submitting a funding application and when you're planning your PPI and incorporating it into your proposal, you have 2 options. You can do this kind of tick box tokenistic PPI, where you say you're going to do all these amazing things in the PPI section, but it's not really integrated into the project as a whole. And from my experience, this is picked up on straight away by public reviewers. They see when something is tokenistic, because more often than not, they've had PPI experience, and they've probably been involved in these types of tokenistic projects, and they just spot it straight away. So the second option then is actually to incorporate some meaningful involvement, meaningful PPI in your application, and really think about the areas that you could really benefit as a researcher, or your project could really benefit from. You might already have questions as you're putting your proposal together about certain elements, and they're the things that it might be really beneficial to get public input. So say, for example, you're worried about study recruitment, and in the past it's been really difficult to recruit people your target population, whatever that might be. But that will be an area that you bring to your PPI group or your PPI contributors working on the project. And you would discuss recruitment with them from the very beginning, and you would brainstorm ideas for recruiting and reaching your target population. And, that's something that will really benefit you as a researcher, but also the research project. And it's not just doing it for the sake of it. You're really involving them in an area that you need their help and you need their expertise. So where do you start? For the HRB application, I always see it as a two-step process. So the first step is to describe the PPI you've conducted to date prior to the funding application. And then the second step is to describe the PPI you plan to conduct when the project is funded. So for step one, the PPI conducted to date. Were patients, members of the public, involved in the design of the research topic or question in any way? So maybe you don't have a formal PPI group set up, or you don't have, specific PPI contributors, but there might, the idea for this research project might have come about from speaking to patients or speaking with members of the public, or, maybe you're working in practice with patients, or maybe you're linked in with community organizations where this was identified as a really important area, or might have come about from a conversation you had on the street with somebody that would be considered part of your target population, or it might not be the case, and this idea of the research might have completely come from the literature or from your own head, but have a brainstorm and think, okay, where is the idea for this research coming? And it might be a good idea to think about gathering a few PPI contributors or convening a PPI group with members of your target population, so that if you're at the very initial stages of your research, that you could develop your ideas with them. So like I say, it could be a formal research prioritization exercise. So we'll say, for example, the James Lind Alliance conduct these research prioritization exercises with members of the public and patients. And maybe your idea has come from their prioritization exercises, informal chats with patients, previous study participants, etc. So, that the kind of spectrum there is huge in terms of patients and members of the public being involved in the design of research. Did you consult with patients or members of the public on the design of the study? If you're using existing data, were PPI contributors involved when data collection processes were being designed and conducted? Because you might find, if you're using existing data, that there was a public contributor on the steering committee for that data collection study. So there may have been PPI input that you don't necessarily know about. So that's really important. Are you including individual PPI contributors or community patient organizations as a named co-applicant or collaborator on the application? And if you are doing this, so this is really important. This is a really important of the applications in the HRB, and reviewers are really keen to see that you're including them as co-applicants or collaborators. But this goes back to the idea of tokenistic involvement or meaningful involvement. If you are involving them as co-applicants or collaborators, you need to have a clear role. What is their role in this study? Why are you involving them? It's not enough just to involve them as a name on a page. It's really important that you think about their role, that they think about their role, and that you develop your role description together so that both parties are really clear. It's not fair on PPI contributors, whether they're patients, members of the public, community, or patient organizations. It's not fair to add them to your funding application just as a name on a page, and not develop, a really kind of strong relationship with them and involve them in your research. And if you do involve them as a co-applicant or collaborator, you need to make sure that you keep them in the loop, whether the project is funded or if it isn't, that you keep them on board and that you involve them throughout the research, and they're not just there for optics. And I feel very strongly about that because I see it quite often. And to be honest, the public reviewers will see it quite often and they'll spot it straight away. Did you ask members of the public to review and provide feedback on your application? I think this is always a really good idea. Bear in mind that you will have public reviewers looking at your application, so it makes sense to kind of demo that before you submit. And again, don't just do this in a tokenistic way. Make sure that you allow plenty of time. I know, we're always rushing for deadlines, and funding applications are pulled together at the last minute. But even if you could just send one section on to your public reviewers at a time. So when you have a lay summary done, send that on. When you have the PPI section done, send that on, just to get their feedback. Make sure you give them plenty of time. Make sure you're linked in with them, or somebody on your team is linked in with them, that if they have any questions, they can ask. And it could be a good idea as well to include prompts for them. So as they're reading, if you have questions yourself over the way things are written, that you could ask them, do you think this is a good way of putting it, or should this be changed to this, or what do you think of this terminology? And you kind of just give them prompts, because if you just fire off a lay summary and ask them for their opinion, you might just get a, yeah, it's fine back. Whereas if you kind of prompt with specific questions, they can really help you in the development of that lay summary. And any of the PPI that you've conducted to date, whether it fits in with this slide or maybe there's other elements that I haven't included, make sure that you mention that in the application. So if you have asked members of the public to review your lay summary, make sure you mention that in the PPI section. And maybe even give some specific details on, the changes that were made as a result of their feedback, because that will show that you are open to receiving feedback, you're open to making changes, and changing your research based on public input. So that's really important. So step 2 then is talking about your future PPI plans. And I'm really of the opinion that, it's quality over quantity here, especially if it's the first time that you're planning any sort of PPI. It's better to do a small amount of good quality PPI than a lot of poor quality PPI. And like I say, especially if you're starting out, it can be quite daunting. And if your research isn't patient facing and you're not quite sure what the role of PPI is in your study, then build it into the parts of the research that you feel it will really make a difference. But I'll go through a few red flags in a minute, but don't go in with this idea that PPI contributors are going to be involved in all aspects of your research, when really that probably isn't going to be possible, and you don't have the experience to do that. So it's really important to remember that PPI is really not a one size fits all. There are so many different ways of conducting PPI, whether it's involving individual PPI contributors, whether it's convening PPI groups, whether it's working with patient organizations or local community organizations. Some PPI is very much kind of once-off PPI, where you do one day or one meeting or one phone call. Another PPI then can be like I mentioned with the Ideas Project, very much an ongoing process throughout the duration of the research study. So there's no magic formula when it comes to PPI. It really depends on your research, on the nature of your research and the context of your research, and what you think will work best to suit that. So here are some, I call them the 5 W's of meaningful PPI. So just some questions to think about when you're planning your PPI and writing up your PPI section of the funding application. The first W is why. Why are you involving people? What do you think they're going to add or help with? What is the purpose of their involvement? And that's really important, because, if you really want to do meaningful PPI, you need to have that why. When you know your why, your how becomes a lot easier. Who are you involving? So are you looking for people with the specific maybe disease or target population of your research, or are you looking for carers or family members, maybe health professionals working in that area? And I mentioned earlier this kind of toss up between representativeness and diversity. So PPI is not research. You do not need to have a representative group for your research, for your target population, but it's always good to have diversity. And think about layers of involvement. It might make sense in certain elements of the study to involve healthcare professionals. It might make sense in other areas to involve carers or family members. You know, you need to think about, okay, maybe sometimes, say, for example, if you're wondering how to recruit study participants with a specific condition, let's say asthma, then it probably would make sense that you would involve people that have experience of living with asthma to help you direct the right way to go in terms of recruiting. But if you're coming to the end of the study and you're, say you're creating a press release on the results of the study and you want to get it out to the general population, then it doesn't necessarily need to be people with asthma that review that press release. You might actually be better off to get general members of the public that have no expertise or experience with asthma, so that they will, you know, provide that review from a kind of more general broader perspective, if that's who your target population is with the press release. So think about the different stages of your study, basically going back to your why are you involving people, what are you thinking they're going to help with, and you can design your who around that. And then it's also worth considering who is facilitating or who is coordinating the PPI. So it's really important that you have a contact person for your PPI. So one kind of nominated person that is in touch with your PPI contributors. So it's not different people from the research team always. But at the same time, you need to be careful of the power dynamics. So who's going to facilitate, if you're going to have PPI meetings with a group, who's going to facilitate those meetings? And I suppose just to be aware that there can be a power imbalance for a lot of people. You know, working with the research project in UCC is a very big deal. You know, meeting a professor or meeting a team of doctors can be, you know, quite intimidating. So it might make sense to have a facilitator that isn't necessarily the most senior person on the team. And I've seen so often in the past with loads of different PPI groups, you know, the dynamic in the room when a PhD student is facilitating, and then how quickly the dynamic can change when the professor walks in the room. So it's just worth thinking about it and thinking about, okay, does the facilitator need some facilitation skill training or practice and so on. So where are you going to find people? Where are you going to advertise? That's really important, that you're not just, a lot of people go to Twitter with their PPI flyer, and that's fantastic, and you'll probably get a brilliant response rate. But Twitter is a certain type of person, particularly people that are linked in with research networks on Twitter. So you just need to be mindful that you're gaining diversity, that you're advertising in different places so that you can hear different voices in your research. And then where are you going to run meetings is really important. So is it going to be a neutral location? Are you going to invite them on campus to UCC? If you do that, make sure you get a good room that has accessible parking. The room, actually, the location can really change the dynamic of a meeting as well. So it's important to think about where the PPI is going to take place. Maybe it's online, actually. A lot of PPI in the last 2 years has been conducted on Zoom, and that can bring additional advantages and disadvantages. So it's been fantastic because it doesn't limit you geographically. You can involve people from all over the country or all over the world, but at the same time, you need to be careful because the dynamic and the kind of interaction in the group can be a little different to meeting in person. And we all are well aware of that now at this stage. When are you going to involve them? So at what stages of the study? This really looks back kind of to your why. So if you have a look at the timeline of your research, it would be good to have a look at you know, the stages of your research and where you think the involvement of PPI contributors would make the most difference. So say, for example, you know, the study recruitment phase, like I mentioned already, or developing study materials, or maybe in data collection phase, where you could, you know, pilot your interview, your topic guide, or your interview schedule. Or maybe you might even ask them to conduct interviews with you, or help to administer the questionnaire, or, you know, whatever it is that you're doing. So have a look through your project Gantt chart and identify the stages that you think would be most relevant to your PPI contributors. And then what are you going to ask them to do? So once you've identified the stages, you need to kind of start thinking about, okay, what is it that you're going to ask them to do? Is it going to be a very general task? Like, I keep going back to recruitment. It's just in my head today, but say for study recruitment, you know, it could be a general brainstorm. How are we going to reach these different populations? You know, what organizations, you know, do you know of, or what outlets or communication channels? And it could be very general, or it could be something really specific, like, will you review this recruitment questionnaire, recruitment flyer, or can you help with input to this patient information sheet? Or, you know, so it can be really broad or it can be really specific. And even with things like the recruitment flyer, you might sit down with a blank piece of paper and develop a flyer together with your PPI contributors, or the research team might develop a flyer and then you might ask for PPI contributors to provide feedback and input. So it really, there's so many different ways of involving, but these are just some of the 5 W's to help you think about planning your research. Okay, so because there is no one size fits all with PPI, there is no gold standard for PPI involvement. I can't tell you what to put in your PPI section of the funding application, because that really depends on your research area, your research context, and it depends on you as a researcher. So I can't give you a standard PPI section that you can just use as a template. That's not what PPI is about. But what I can tell you is what not to put in there. So these are some of the major red flags when I review PPI sections of funding applications. The first is when people say things like, patients and members of the public will be involved in all aspects of the research project, from the generation of the initial research idea right through to the dissemination of results. This is a major red flag, because the chances are that is not going to be possible unless you have, you know, PPI contributors sitting down next to you at your desk every single day in every single meeting that you attend. Then they're not going to be involved in all aspects of the research project. So it's much more realistic to state the specific areas that they're going to have a specific input into, and then it comes across a lot more meaningful and realistic to the reviewers. So that's the first red flag. The second red flag is when people say they're going to identify PPI partners using existing networks known to the research team. Now, it's fine to do this for 1 or 2 of your PPI partners, but just be careful about using the same PPI partners over and over again. Because, well, first of all, you're burdening them and maybe over researching with them, but also you want to ensure this idea of diversity, of getting, you know, different voices, different perspectives, different input into your research. So if you're identifying people who have been involved, you know, time and time again, and you're not looking, you know, at the broader kind of community, then you might be really missing out on some really valuable views. So that's another thing that you just need to be careful of, that you're not using the same people over and over again. The next thing is we will ensure that they are representative of the target population for this project. And again, this is something I've touched on earlier. PPI is not research. If you're convening a group of 5 PPI contributors for your project, maybe 7, maybe even 10, you can't expect that group to be totally, wholly representative of your target population. That's not how PPI works. Yes, strive for diversity, try and get as many differing opinions and backgrounds and perspectives as you can, but you're not looking for them, you know, you're not looking to tick boxes and say, okay, we've, you know, 1 male, 1 female, 1, you know, person in their 20s, 1 person from Cork, 1 from, you know, it doesn't work like that. And so you're not striving for representativeness. Due to ethical concerns regarding the payment of research participants, our partners will not be paid for their time. This is another major red flag. The HRB are quite clear that they expect PPI contributors to be paid for their involvement on the project, both payment for their time and the hours they put in, but also covering any out-of-pocket expenses that they might incur. So, you know, whether that's travel, whether it's parking, whether it's whatever it is, that will need to be to be covered. And I'm going to talk about payment a little bit more in a minute. The project principal investigator will hold focus groups with PPI partners to elicit their views and perspectives. So I again touched on this earlier. Just be careful about who is facilitating the groups. I'm not saying that the principal investigator isn't always best placed, but do be careful of power imbalances and how that might affect the kind of feedback that the group give to the researchers. If you've the person, like for example, the principal investigator of the project, you know, the person that's come up with this research idea, the person that's responsible for implementing the research, conducting the research and implementing, they're going to be naturally quite protective and you know, maybe even defensive of the research that they're doing. And it can be hard for PPI contributors to criticize elements of the research or to poke holes in the research if they feel the person who's, you know, developed the whole idea is standing in front of them. It would take somebody pretty brave to be able to criticize somebody's research to their face. So, you know, sometimes it's good to have maybe a more junior person on the team, or maybe an independent facilitator if you have the resources to do that. But at least think about the power dynamics and how they might affect the group. The next one is focus groups. So with PPI contributors, you are not collecting data. You are not asking them for their experiences. You're asking them for their perspectives. You're not recording conversations. Yes, you might take notes, but it's not, they're group discussions rather than formal focus groups. So you need to be really careful that you don't blur the lines between qualitative research and PPI. If you can imagine, your relationship with your PPI contributors should be very similar to your relationship with other advisory members on your team. So say, for example, you might consult a health economist on certain elements of the project, or you might consult a statistician to help with your statistics. You would never consider writing in your proposal that you would hold a focus group with your statistician. So just be careful of the language you use, and you should be working with your PPI partners in the same way that you work with other stakeholders on the project. So the next red flag is ethical approval and written informed consent will be obtained prior to the focus groups. PPI, if it is done right and it is not blurred, the lines aren't blurred between PPI and qualitative research or even quantitative research. If you're genuinely involving PPI contributors as co-researchers in the process, then you do not need ethical approval because you're not collecting their data. You don't need written informed consent. If you are not sure whether your PPI requires ethical approval or not, I would recommend contacting the relevant ethics committee, outlining, you know, the purpose of your PPI group, the tasks or the activities they're going to be involved in, and you know, asking, does this require ethical approval, just so you have that kind of confirmation on paper. But if PPI is done correctly, it does not require ethical approval. But you need to be really sure that you are doing your PPI correctly and that you're not collecting their data and you're not recording groups and you're not transcribing discussions, or you're not, you know, issuing a questionnaire halfway through your PPI involvement. Sometimes the lines can get blurred there as well when people, you know, do PPI, they have PPI contributor input in their project, and then maybe as time goes on, they decide they want to evaluate the PPI, and all of a sudden then they're asking their PPI contributors to complete an evaluation questionnaire, or they're asking them for one-to-one interviews on their experience of being involved. Then again, you're blurring the lines. You will need ethical approval for that. So just be careful of that. And again, recorded and transcribed verbatim. You will not be recording any of your PPI group sessions or meetings or phone calls, or, you know, any of that. That's not the purpose of PPI. Yes, you can take notes, but really the outcome of PPI should be changes to the research. So instead of, you know, recording a meeting where you're asking them, you know, to provide input on a particular, you know, document, associated with the study, then you actually work on that document together and, you know, and edit the document together so that that's the outcome of the meeting rather than recording their discussions, if that makes sense. So then just on payment, so the HRB are really, like I mentioned, really clear. So this is just an example from one of the their funding schemes, the investigator-led projects, their guidance notes, where they say that where members of the public or patients are involved, they must be compensated for their time and contributions. So, you know, you're told by the HRB this is really important. So please don't forget to include payment in your budget. And this is based on the idea that, you know, it's inequitable to expect people who are unpaid to work alongside other members of the research team who are paid. You know, a lot of PPI contributors might have to travel to get to a meeting. They might have to, you know, give up the opportunity of paid work to be there to help you. And it's only fair that you respect and you value their contributions and you at least offer payment. Not all PPI contributors want to be paid. Sometimes they want other forms of acknowledgement, which I'll talk about in the next slide, but absolutely have the money there in your budget, not just for the reimbursement of expenses. So that might include, you know, carer costs if they need to get a carer involved. It might include child costs, you know, taxis, parking, travel, maybe even overnight stays if they need to travel to meetings, and so on. So make sure you include the reimbursement of expenses, but it also includes the payment for time. And this very much depends on your project. Usually here in UCC, whenever I involve PPI contributors, I would calculate it at 20 to 25 euros per hour. So whether that's an online meeting, whether it's, you know, an in-person meeting, maybe it's a phone call, maybe they're asked to review a document in their own time, I would ask them to log their hours and each hour would be paid according to that rate. So, you know, tot up the hours that you expect, you know, the number of PPI contributors that will be involved, the hours you expect their input. Again, not just for meetings, but if you ask them to review materials outside of meetings, you will need to provide payment for that as well. So make sure you include that in the budget. Now, I suppose you don't need to really worry about this at the research funding application stage, but just to point out that payment isn't always a straightforward process. Some PPI contributors prefer not to be paid. Some need to be paid in different ways, depending on their own kind of circumstances. Sometimes vouchers are used. So yes, you know, feel free to come and talk to me when your project is funded. And I say when, not if, but when your project is funded and you're looking at ways to actually process the payment. Other ways of recognizing PPI contributions, and it's important to put this into your application as well. You know, payment is really important, but sometimes PPI contributors get involved for different reasons. So firstly, the importance of feedback. You always need to feedback to your PPI group, you know, the changes that were made to the research as a result of their input. So, you know, even a quick email to say, thanks so much for your suggestions last week. As a result, we've done X, Y, Z. We thought this particular idea was fantastic, and we've decided to go ahead with it, or whatever it is. So just to make sure that your PPI contributors are aware of how their contributions are making a difference, because that's the reason why a lot of them get involved. They get involved to feel like they're making a difference. So that's really important. Also, providing opportunities for social interaction. So a lot of PPI contributors get involved because they want to meet other people in similar situations. They want to have that social support and social peer network. So it would be worth building those opportunities into your PPI plan. So say, for example, if you're hosting a half-day PPI event, that you make sure there's time built into that event for tea and coffee and general chit-chat. Or, you know, maybe you have an event planned and then maybe you might provide lunch afterwards for everyone to have a chat and mix and mingle. And a lot of the time you'll get real like golden nuggets during those chats as well for your research, but it's not necessarily, you know, during the meeting time, but that's really important. Some PPI contributors like to attend specific conferences, so you might be able to cover their attendance and pay their fees. sometimes they might want to be involved in presenting findings. Other times they might just want to be a listener or bystander. So, it's worth exploring with your PPI group whether there's things like that they'd like to be involved in. Internal training opportunities. So I've been involved in projects in the past where PPI contributors ask, if we could provide training in public speaking, or, they might want to enroll in certain university existing training courses that are there. So it's worth, exploring this with your group as well. A printed certificate of involvement. So this was something that came up in one of the projects I was involved in towards the end, when I was asking them, what were there any other ways that we could recognize their contributions. They said, we'd love a certificate to say that we were PPI contributors on this project. That was something that cost very little for the research team, but it really demonstrated that we valued their time and their commitment to the project, and they had printed proof of that. So that's just another idea. So that's just an overview of PPI and how to prepare the PPI sections of funding applications. For more tips, there are plenty of resources on our website. The link is there. I have a specific document for tips for writing the PPI section of a funding application. That's up on the website at that link. I also have a PPI planning template that's up on that link. And there's a presentation on PPI and funding applications that was delivered by Dr. Anne Cody from the HRB at the UL PPI Summer School. So there's a link to that presentation here if you want to hear more about the HRB perspective. So have a look at those links for further information. Top tips for researchers. We're going to hear from Casey here again with her top tips.
So what are my top tips for researchers in PPI? My number one top tip is to build a relationship with your PPI contributors as soon as possible. I know budgeting time and costs can be quite challenging. I'm not saying, go beyond what you can do, but it really does impact the research. And, if I know I'm going to have a bit of fun, or at least, be doing something interesting, and if I feel wanted, by the researcher, I'm going to give so much more to the research. Time allows me to feel comfortable. It allows me to do possible trainings that may be important for the research. It allows me just to settle in. So that would be my number one tip. Build a relationship as soon as you can. For me, also, accessibility is essential. So whether, I'm talking about physical disability, there's many other disabilities such as, psychological disability or communication disability, having the right signs up so they're understandable to everyone. Having lift work and just them ways to make sure that the person can get in without them having to overcome a challenge. I'd often get to a place on a bus. I travel by bus on the wheelchair, and then just off the bus, my wheelchair stops working or something like that. So also, maybe giving your number or at least your email to PPI contributors and, saying, call me if you need me. You obviously don't want to be giving away too much information, but you want to be friendly and make sure that the contributor feels comfortable to call you if needed. It's like before a meeting, if they're stuck, or just after. And I guess a huge tip would also be letting PPI contributors know as much as possible about their role. Uncertainty is huge for me because, I have to plan where I'm going. I have to know if a place is accessible. I have to know what time the bus is going at, etc. So I know 1 or 2 offers ago, I would say, time commitment roles just it stopped me from being able to contribute to some research that I actually really wanted to get involved in, but I just couldn't because I didn't know, excuse me, the time, and like I've physical appointments, different things going on, like they all do. So it was just important for me to know, that would be Tuesday evenings, let's say, or, a Saturday on Zoom, etc. So details like that would definitely impact me contributing or not. So yeah, that'd be my top 3 tips for you today. Best of luck with all that you're doing, guys.
Okay, so thanks to Casey for providing input and highlighting the PPI contributor perspective. Very quickly, I just want to talk a little bit about PPI Ignite Network at UCC. So basically, we're a national PPI Ignite network. There are 7 university institutions across Ireland part of this network, UCC being one of them. And we're co-funded by the HRB and the Irish Research Council, and the 7 higher education institutions as well. So basically our aim here in UCC is to build capacity for high quality PPI, both within UCC and amongst wider society, and embed PPI within the institutional policies and practices of the university. So we've got loads of different national partners, lots of different local partners that we work with. I won't go through them in detail, but you'll get an idea of them from their logos here. How PPI Ignite Network at UCC can help you. So we have a number of different PPI training courses in the pipeline. We are also organising plenty of PPI events, both in the university and public events. We also provide PPI support, so videos like this. And if you have any questions after this presentation, please do get in touch, and I can provide some additional support for you in the preparation of your funding application. We also provide seed funding to researchers. So for those, you won't have this problem because of course you're going to include PPI in your project budget, but for researchers that don't have the budget to conduct PPI, we will have a seed funding program available with small pots of money to help you conduct PPI. We will also have PPI methodological research funding grants available, so stay tuned. I suppose that's in the pipeline to provide funding to researchers to maybe do some sort of evaluation on their PPI. So that will be available as well. And from next summer onwards, we'll have summer studentships in PPI. So we'll be advertising that across the university as well. So I'm more than happy for you to get in touch. We've got further information on our website, lots of resources on our website. There's also the National PPI Ignite Network website. We're on Twitter as well to keep up to date with PPI training courses and events and so on. Probably Twitter is the best place. And then I'm happy for you to email me if you have any further questions about your PPI and your funding application. More than happy for you to email me at the email address there. So best of luck with your application, and do let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.